Is Victor Wembanyama a legitimate MVP candidate? Will Amen Thompson make the leap into stardom? Maxwell Baumbach and I are going to preview the 2025 NBA season by discussing the top NBA juniors coming up in this edition of the Locked On NBA Draft with No Ceilings podcast.
You are Locked On NBA Draft with No Ceilings, your daily podcast on the future stars of the NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for making Locked On NBA Draft with No Ceilings your first listen of the day. I'm your host, Nathan Grubel, current No Ceilings contributor, scouting consultant, evaluator of prospects over the last 14 years. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network and are available wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to subscribe, rate, review. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you get $300 in bonus bets. Download the FanDuel.com app to get started. Joining me this week is my co-host, lead columnist, and creator of the No Stone Unturned series for No Ceilings, Maxwell Baumbach. Maxwell, how are we doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to talk about these juniors in the NBA. I feel like it's so important for us to keep in mind at all times in the draft world. We are projecting forward. We are projecting to the NBA. There are lessons to be learned from these players that we're going to talk about today. And I think it's always so critical to just keep an eye on what's happening in the league and what we can learn from that as we project future classes.
I could have said it better myself, Maxwell. On today's episode, we're going to start our 2025-26 NBA preview series. We're going to look at the league's top young players. Starting off with the junior class this episode, we'll discuss Victor Wembanyama's preseason MVP case, Amen Thompson's potential leap into stardom or superstardom, and wrap up by giving our thoughts on the developmental trajectories of Brandon Miller and Toumani Camara. Before we get started, do want to shout out the other members of the Locked On NBA Draft with No Ceilings team. Both Tyler Rucker and Tyler Metcalf just released 2 episodes talking about the best international prospects in the upcoming 2026 NBA Draft, while also reflecting on 2 preseason scrimmages from some top college programs in Arizona and Duke. And then Corey Tulaba and Albert Gim recently touched on Arkansas's Darius Acuff and why he's the most polarizing guard prospect in the class. You can listen to or watch those episodes wherever you get your podcast. All right, Maxwell, NBA juniors. I'm so excited for us to be able to hit on the NBA for a little bit because, as you said, it is important for scouts and evaluators to watch enough of and pay enough attention to the level of competition that they're evaluating for. If you just get lost watching college film, mid-major stuff, low-major stuff, sometimes, and you and I have fallen victim to this, we've talked about it, you can forget about just how good these guys are in the NBA. You can start talking yourself into prospects and maybe overlooking some questions where you watch the NBA tape for 5 minutes. You're going to get your answer as to why those guys potentially aren't NBA draft prospects. So it's really, really, really important for us to keep in mind the high bar that the NBA sets on a nightly basis. And what better way to remind ourselves of that high bar than talking about arguably the highest bar, arguably the tallest bar in the NBA, and Victor Wembanyama, third-year player. Last year, he only played in 46 games due to that really weird situation he found himself in with the blood clots. But 46 games played, 1,527 minutes logged, 24 points per game, 11 rebounds, 3.7 assists, 47.6, 35.2, 83.6 shooting splits, which for a 7'4" guy, now officially listed at 7'4", insane. 8.8 3-point attempts per game. No, folks, that's not per 100 possessions. That's just flat out per game. 4.1 free throw attempts, 3.8 blocks, 1.1 steals, 3.2 turnovers. Maxwell, there were only 2 players who played greater than or equal to 1,500 minutes last NBA season who logged a rebounding rate better than 17%, an assist rate better than 18%, and a block rate north of 6%. And that would be Victor Wembanyama and Anthony Davis, who are arguably 2 of the most transformational NBA draft prospects we've seen, certainly in the time that I've been evaluating. Like I said, I've been at this. I'm going into my 15th year of player evaluation. I saw Anthony Davis up close to Kentucky. I wasn't able to see Victor in person before the 2023 draft, but needless to say, everything we saw on film, we could talk about it for days, like just how special of a prospect this guy was. But I think it's important to keep in mind, we're going to wax poetic about some of the defensive stuff, but he had a 30 usage rate in those 1,500 minutes last year, which only 3 other forwards and bigs were ahead of him that registered 1,500 minutes, in Anthony Davis, Paolo Banchero, and Giannis Antetokounmpo. Like, just how efficient he was across the board, the swing that he had on that San Antonio Spurs team in terms of their plus minus ratings, how well they fared, points per 100 possessions, the kind of difference that he made. It's incredible to think about, putting it in context. Just, again, the level of production that he was able to match compared to where his shot diet ultimately fell. Like, this is a guy who took 513 jump shots and 385 rim attempts as a 7'4" guy. And yet he was as efficient as he was. He was able to dictate the offensive flow, and then to still have, the energy, the resilience to do every single little thing on the defensive end of the floor for that Spurs team. I mean, what we've been able to watch through 2 seasons in the NBA, he truly is a unicorn of unicorns. And it's important to keep in mind that, like, sometimes when we look to make comparisons to NBA players, there are true unicorns out there that we just shouldn't use as a comparison for guys. And Victor Wembanyama is probably one of those players. What are some of the things, Maxwell, you've seen from the NBA as he's been able to develop over these last 2 years heading into year 3?
Yeah, I think obviously what's so intriguing to me, you can start on the defensive end of the floor. There's just so few guys that can do what he does. I mean, the measurements alone, but the fact that he can, even move at all, but then you factor in the lateral agility, his ability to cover ground, the way that he changes directions and space if he has to rotate out to a perimeter shooter and the ball gets skipped quickly and he has to X out or whatever. Like, just his ability to get to spots with that length is unparalleled. It's just not something we've seen before. And it manifests itself with a ridiculous block rate. And it's one of those block rates that you see, and generally you're anticipating it to be a guy who just kind of hangs out around the basket, but he does give you that perimeter versatility at the same time. And then offensively, I think what is so intriguing to me, where I worried about him, like, the year before his pre-draft season, was everyone's like, oh, wow, this guy, like, he's enormous and he can really shoot, whatever. And the shot hadn't really actualized yet. And that's really continuing to come along. The fact that he went 35.2% from 3 and took 8.8 attempts per game.
Stupid. Yeah.
And, like, I don't know, like, I'm so excited to see what he's going to look like in this new context this year, because between Dylan Harper, even if he ends up just being, a solid rookie instead of like a good NBA player out of the gate, and then De'Aaron Fox, it's just so much more offensive weaponry than we've seen around him, that I'm interested to see what he could look like if he can scale back in the usage like we talked about. This guy, was launching a lot of pull-up threes and a lot of pull-up mid-range shots. I do want to see him improve his shot selection. He was in ISOs more than most guys his size were. And you just wonder, like, what is that efficiency going to look like? Obviously, you want to see the process get a little bit better, find those teammates more consistently now that he's got some better ones around him. But I think that it's kind of scary to think about what Victor Wembanyama has been as a basketball player so far, and then think, okay, well, now it's about to get easier for him. Like, that is frightening to me. And I think that's where, obviously, there needs to be skill improvements. Obviously, I'd like if the release was a little bit higher. I'd like if he got his feet set under him on those pull-up shots. I'd like it if he was a little bit less locked into getting his own bucket and keeping his eyes up for teammates more consistently. I would love all of that, but the fact that the context around him is going to be more favorable is fascinating. And I think if he can make those improvements in that context, that's where we could be talking MVP.
You and I are thinking along the same wavelength in terms of improving his shot selection and sort of seeing what can he become as a more interior focused scorer.
Yes.
You think about the leap that Evan Mobley took last year with the Cleveland Cavaliers, and all of a sudden you can see his improved frame, the amount of muscle that he's put on, the added strength, and how much it carried into his physicality as a driver, how all of a sudden he was looking to punish opposing players and put them underneath the basket. And I know it was one clip from a silver and black scrimmage that the Spurs just had for their fans. I actually did watch the whole scrimmage, but just the improved physicality that Wemby's already starting to sort of harness and play with. Like when he pushed Luke Cornett out of the way and just put him underneath the basket and had that slam. Like, Luke Cornett is not a weak guy by any means. And I get it. It's a scrimmage. You're not trying to hurt guys. I get all that, but That's the type of stuff that I want to see from Wembanyama moving forward, because if he can mix up more of that shot diet, right? If he improves as a floater guy, right, inside the paint. We talked when we were discussing our center episode, right, how to scout centers for the NBA draft. We touched on how important like the runner push shot is for big men. He only attempted like 19 of them last year registered per Synergy Sports. So if that's something that can consistently improve for him, he's dunking all over guys, getting to the free throw line more frequently, on top of everything he can already do as a jump shooter and defender. I mean, the sky really is the limit for him in terms of impact. He was per dunks and threes 5th in actualized estimated plus minus last year behind SGA, Jokic, Doncic, and Giannis. Like, he was already pretty much 5th in MVP conversations had he been healthy for the entire year. And if the Spurs hit on their over 44.5 wins provided to us by our lovely sponsors at FanDuel, if they finish anywhere close to top 4 through 6 in the Western Conference, and he takes those meaningful steps forward as an interior scorer, an all-around playmaking threat, showing off a little bit more passing, even than he did last year, registering that 18 assist rate like I was talking about, he will be in the thick of the MVP race. His current odds sit at FanDuel plus 1,200. That, to me, listen, he is a solid flyer to potentially make that wager on. I really like where his trajectory is going. And again, if he can lift up that roster around him, you talked about some of the offensive weapons he has. Some of those guys like De'Aaron Fox really weren't there for him. Dylan Harper wasn't there for him. Stefan Castle was a rookie. He didn't have another efficient finisher at the big man spot next to him like a Luke Cornett.
Yeah, Luke Cornett, I think, is like a big one. Like any of the 4 or 5 lineups, like he just has not had somebody who's that good at basketball. Is Luke Cornett. Like that is a really meaningful upgrade, even if you're not one of the people who's like super high on Cornett.
Yeah, those guys weren't there for him last year, but yet their offensive rating, the Spurs, when he was on the floor, was 114.6. That would have been tied for 18th in the league. So you're talking about when he's off the floor, like a bottom 5 offense in the league, and he's dragging them by himself into contention for around middle level of the league. You're talking about now an improved supporting cast around him, more spacing, and improved Victor Wembanyama. I don't know. I just think the case is ripe for the making in terms of him as a potential MVP candidate this year. When we return to the Locked On NBA Draft with No Ceilings podcast, Maxwell and I are going to discuss Amen Thompson's outlook this season with the Houston Rockets and why he's on the doorstep of stardom. Stay tuned. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel's making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. I love using FanDuel as a sports bettor because they have an enormous number of markets to bet and things to bet on, especially when it comes to the NFL. You have same-game parlays, alternate lines, anytime touchdown scores. It makes it really easy to craft a bet slip that gives you the best chance to win big. So are you ready to play? Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet. Thank you for making Locked On NBA Draft Podcast with No Ceilings your first listen of the day. All right, Maxwell, let's shift our conversation to H-Town and talk about one of the most exciting players in the Western Conference in Amen Thompson. Just to recap some of his 24-25 numbers, 14.1 points per game, 8.2 rebounds per game, 3.8 assists, shooting almost 56% from the field, 27.5% from three-point range, 68.4% from the line, but 2.7 stocks, 2.0 turnovers, 13.5 rebound rate, 16.9 assist rate. And then his defensive metrics, Maxwell, a 2.1 steal rate and a 3.6 block rate, those are insane numbers.
Not normal.
For an NBA wing. He was the only NBA player last year to play 2,000 plus minutes and register those defensive playmaking numbers. He is an absurd athlete of absurd athletes, and I think it's a big reason why everyone's speaking so highly of him and expect the most from him this season with the Houston Rockets. We understand the offensive leap that he's going to have to make, and I'm sure that's a large part of what you're going to talk about with him, Maxwell. But just to highlight the level of defender he already is, he's arguably the league's best perimeter defender, and he's only getting better. And as he continues to add strength, add to his frame, at 6'7", you're going to continue to see him switch all across the floor. He can hold his own against forwards. He can hold his own on centers. And when he was on the floor last year, I wrote about it for NoSlingsNBA.com, but Tari Eason, they were quite literally the Terror Twins. The level of ground, the amount of ground that they were able to cover, the amount of times that they were able to create deflections, get their hand on the ball, and get that team going out in transition, which was massive for the Rockets because they weren't the best half-court offensive team. They weren't attempting a lot of threes. They weren't, quote-unquote, winning the math battle if you factor in just purely their half-court offensive output. But when you include were they rated as a team from a transition offense standpoint, that's really when a lot of things started to click for the Rockets. And when you have a player like Amen who can feed into the team's identity and embrace those core characteristics that head coach Ime Udoka was trying to impart on his team, he was essentially an extension of the head coach on the floor, along with, the brain trust in Fred VanVleet, some of the other veteran leaders that were there, Dylan Brooks, the growth of Alperen Şengün. But Amen Thompson, to me, is the swing factor for this team in terms of how they can fare in the Western Conference. What are some of the things that you're looking for from Amen Maxwell so that he can take that leap into stardom and really help alleviate some of what they're going to be missing for Fred VanVleet in the backcourt?
Yeah, I mean, he's really just going to have to bring more consistent offensive firepower to the table. And it starts with the shot. And I know that this is going to be a big focal point anytime people are talking about his game. So I, again, want to give him credit. The defense is electric, like you said. He has an exceptional level of feel. He's a really great passer. The types of reads and deliveries that he's able to make on the go are exceptional. I don't want this to seem like I'm down on Amen Thompson or I'm taking anything away from him. I think he's a spectacular young player. That is where the game is going to have to get better. So if you look at the numbers last year, per synergy, he took 80 catch and shoot threes. He went 28.8% on those attempts, and 52 of those 80 were unguarded. So we are not in a good spot right there. Like, that is just so far below average. He ranked in the 14th percentile on spot ups. And what's more is it's not just like, okay, well, like he has a hard time behind the arc. It's that it affects his downhill game. He went 37.8% on twos generated from a spot up. It's just really hard to attack downhill when defenders are so comfortable sagging on him. And he can find some success because his dribble game is so good and he's so creative and he's so shifty. When a guy hangs back around like elbow distance and then he can counter him and get to something inside, when that happens, he's fine. But it's when that defender continues to drop back, he just has a harder and harder time finding something. And I think for that reason, it's going to be really critical that he either, I mean, obviously he has to get better off the catch. Like, that's pretty much a non-negotiable if we're talking about the highest of level outcomes for him. But even if he can just get that stop and pop mid-range shot down, I'll let you kind of talk about the floater because you talked about that off air. And I know that's something you're big on for him. But if he can just make those wide open shots, it would go such a long way just to get that defender to come up a little bit. Because when they're up a little bit, the counter dribble game is so good that he can still get great looks inside. He's great through contact. Like, all that is good. It's just a matter of finding a way to get defenders to come out a little bit so he can beat them downhill.
That mid-range area, Maxwell, is so key. And I don't want to speak too negative on the jumper in the sense of I don't think it's going to get better because he did shoot 37.7% on corner threes last year. That's something that will continue to be a weapon for him. But you are 100% right. In terms of above the break threes, wing threes, he does have to improve as that standstill catch and shoot threat to drag those defenders out. And then when he does get that first step on the defense, which he can do almost at will, he is one of the best, penetrators that we have from the perimeter in the NBA. But that in-between game really is something that has to improve for him. Otherwise, he's not going to be able to leverage his strengths as an on-ball creator, especially when this team, again, without Fred VanVleet, is so desperate for point guard play. In pick and rolls, including passes, he only rated out in the 33rd percentile in terms of effectiveness. So that is something that if it's going to improve, it's going to come from that in-between game when he gets caught in no man land. What is his counter to that? It can't always be, I'm going to go another direction because defenses will continue to collapse on him, force multiple bodies in the lane. He has creativity as a ball handler, but doesn't always have the tightest handle in traffic. So you're going to run into some of those situations where he creates turnovers by himself by trying to drive into 2 or 3 defenders. So I think the biggest thing for him, you mentioned the pull-up jumper. I would absolutely love if he could get that type of pull-up shot. I don't disagree with that. I think what makes Amen so special is his ability to capitalize on his speed and his downhill momentum to where I don't even want him wasting time trying to go to another dribble move to set up a pull-up shot. I would really love for him to get that dynamic floater in place. And look, I don't think I've ever mentioned this guy as a potential comparison or an aspect of his game as a comparison. My favorite player to watch in all of NBA history that I've been able to consume for as long as I've been alive and watching basketball. I can't speak to the 60s, 70s, 80s, but I can speak to the 2000s and on. And my favorite player to be able to watch was Derrick Rose. And that floater game of his was really, in my opinion, what made him so special as a scorer, because he wasn't this awesome knockdown three-point shooter. He wasn't even always the most reliable, consistent mid-range scorer. We knew he was explosive at the rim, just like Amen was, an electric dunking machine. But that floater game was really what separated him as a scorer, because it was that in-between answer for him. And I think I view them the same as players in the sense of I want them to capitalize as often as possible on that speed, that downhill momentum. I don't want them wasting any time. I want Amen to be able to get up with that floater and just make defenses pay if they are going to sag too far back off of him. That to me would tie everything together beautifully. And that to me, again, improving as a standstill shooter, sharpening up his handle in tight spaces, and then developing some sort of that go-to floater while also continuing to progress as one of the NBA's best overall defenders. I mean, that to me puts him on a star level trajectory in a way that we haven't really seen from a perimeter player in recent memory, quite like he can do it. He is that special, that unicorn of an athlete. And I'm really excited to watch him with the Houston Rockets this season. When we return to the Locked On NBA Draft with No Ceilings podcast, Maxwell and I are going to wrap up the show by touching on the upward trajectories of two wings in the NBA's junior class, in Brandon Miller and Toumani Camara. Stay tuned. Most people can't name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth, whether it's 401ks, properties, or investments. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. That's why there's Monarch Money. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or your phone. Money Monarch does all the heavy lifting for you. You can link all your accounts in minutes, see clear data visuals, get smart categorization of your spending, and finally feel in control of your money without ever touching a spreadsheet. I, for one, am trying to manage multiple long-term goals like paying off my car, making a dent in my mortgage, and saving up for my wife and I's first dog, as well as a few other improvements around the house. With Monarch Money, my wife and I can establish a budget and easily strategize around making sure our short-term bills are taken care of without sacrificing our long-term financial goals. Don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code LOCKEDONNBA. Welcome back to the Locked On NBA Draft with No Ceilings podcast. All right, Maxwell, let's wrap up the show by discussing a few of our favorite wing standouts in the NBA's junior class. I know you were interested in discussing Brandon Miller of the Charlotte Hornets. Why don't you lead us off by talking about where Miller was for you as a prospect and how he's been able to develop heading into his third NBA season?
Yeah, so I had him behind Scoot Henderson and ahead of Amen Thompson, which like L's all around in that ranking situation. So I think what makes Brandon Miller so interesting to me is I think he's still like a very enviable good player. The Charlotte context is not ideal. I think we're not the biggest fans of how things have played out for that organization over the past few years, but Brandon Miller was a great pick in hindsight. I think where I love him going forward is I think what he's bringing to the table is still exceptionally valuable. He is a very big player who will get after it on the glass, who's going to shoot a ton of threes. He's going to make a lot of them. And he's going to make good decisions with the ball, and he's going to compete defensively, especially within a team context. Like, all of that is really good. I think the hangups with Brandon Miller are exactly what we thought the hangups were going to be coming out. Yep. If you're talking about star level projection, the star stuff is not there. He really struggles to get to the rim of his own accord. He's a very upright player that really limits how vertically explosive he can be when he gets to the rim, which is why he's also a poor finisher in the limited amount of shots he gets at the rim. He also has a hard time against physicality. He doesn't really carve out space very well in the mid-range. The pull-up two has never really been a shot for him. as soon as he's sort of bumped, everything just really comes unglued. It was the same story to Alabama. It's continued to be the same story in the NBA. I just don't know how much ground he can really make up in that sense. It's not something you see kind of come along particularly often when those traits are lacking. But I do think he's awesome. Like if I'm Charlotte, he's still the one guy I really want to be a part of this organization, because this is like the most valuable skill set. Otherwise, a good decision maker with, length and size, who's going to bomb threes and get after it on the glass. Like I love Brandon Miller as a player. I'm still just getting a little bit dubious of that star upside. And I'm curious to see what it looks like this year.
Listen, he ran into some injury trouble last year. He only played in 27 games. It certainly impacted his finishing from 2-point range. He was only 40.3% from the field. You mentioned some of the at rim stuff. Yeah, his rim pressure was non-existent through his first 2 seasons in the NBA. Granted, last year wasn't a full year, but we can obviously only go off of what we're able to see and evaluate. And he ranked near the bottom of the league in terms of at rim attempts. The good news is in his second year of NBA play, he did improve as a rim finisher. And I was fortunate enough to watch the Charlotte Hornets' first preseason game against the Oklahoma City Thunder, which, listen, that game is up for an entirely different discussion on a different day in terms of the results of it. But what I saw, particularly from Brandon Miller, I did see that more physical driver. I did see that guy who was willing to operate more in the mid-range, switch up some of his shot selection, and not just be an exclusive three-point shooter, which, again, some of the numbers behind that, he had a .597 three-point attempt rate, which means 60% of his shots were threes. That's very, very high and disproportionate. And then a .161 free throw attempt rate, which again, that plays into that disproportionate shot selection. So in terms of improvement areas, we do have to see that balance itself out. I do still want to see him continue and improve as an on-ball defender, particularly in terms of navigating screens, sticking with guys, showing some of that defensive versatility. But you laid it out perfectly, Maxwell. He is 6'9". He's massive. He's a competent basketball player. He can shoot. He is not a lost cause on defense, and that's the exact archetype of wing that NBA teams want on their roster. So Charlotte at least has, one standout diamond for their future. We'll see if LaMelo can continue to improve on his upward trajectory. We'll see where we get out of Con Knipple this year with the Charlotte Hornets and some of their other draft picks. I'm still very interested to see what happens in Charlotte. I don't know how many wins they're going to get, but if the team ends up becoming successful, it's going to be because Brandon Miller took meaningful steps forward in his third year. I want to wrap up the last guy we're going to talk about today. Maxwell, I try and give you as many flowers as possible throughout the course of our scouting discourse. And this is an important one for me because I was not in on Toumani Camara before the draft process. You actually ended up selling me on him more because what I saw from Toumani Camara at Dayton, this massive forward who wanted to impose his will as a scorer, but did not go about it in efficient ways. He forced a lot of offense. He wasn't making a lot of good decisions. He was turning the ball over a lot, but you saw a very energetic and active forward who could make plays on the defensive end, who was willing to mix it up, who was willing to, at the very least, be aggressive and physical in the right ways for his team. And that's everything that we've seen and more with the Portland Trailblazers. As a matter of fact, he's essentially transformed himself into not only a forward defender, focusing more on like the help defensive aspects around the rim, but he has become like a Swiss Army knife. I'm just going to guard every single position that's possible on the court, and I'm going to do it very well. He is that type of lethal perimeter defender. He's been an awesome defensive playmaker. He flies around everywhere. And then offensively, it's really interesting. And I think it's a good thing to talk about from a scouting perspective when we focus on this next draft coming up is someone may not be the best at being the quote unquote star. Everything runs through this guy. He's making all the decisions. He's doing everything. But if you can scale his game down and you can project him into specific roles, all of a sudden you can find a home for him offensively. And that's really what's happened with Toumani Camara. He's been a good spot up shooter in the NBA. We can talk about his defense, but really what he's been to me as a role player story is something that not every prospect we evaluate may have his, his physical tools and his blend of, insane motor to combine along with that. But I think there's a lesson to be learned here that we can project across a number of different prospects as we evaluate for coming NBA drafts.
Yeah, I mean, you go back to the Dayton tape, and like you said, there were certainly warts on it. I think he's actually been a much better defender than I would have expected him to be. But the physicality, the rebounding, the defensive production, I liked the flashes as a passer. And I remember like that was one of the one things that we talked about pre-draft was like the turnovers were bad, but there were some really nice like passes, backdoor cutters and stuff. The key with him was always going to be the shot. Like he was always a guy who was solid on unguarded shots. And you kind of hoped that could lead to something more, and it has. I think a big part of turning the dial for him this year is going to be working on the interior finishing. For like lack of a better phrase, it just seems like he kind of panics around the basket sometimes, and whether it's a cut or self-created. Like the handle isn't great. He's a big guy who's like never going to be the best at putting it on the deck. He's not super fluid or shifty. Like that's just not his game. But you'd wish he'd hold his line a little bit better for how big he is. You wish he was a little bit more composed when he got the ball off a cut, went up a little more into the basket directly instead of kind of fading away or rushing difficult looks at looping angles. And you wish he was a little wiser with how he selected some of the angles he takes inside. But I think if the finishing comes along, like this is going to be one of the premier role players in the league if he's not already.
100%. And I specifically wrote down, the on-ball offensive opportunities that he can take more advantage of. Like you talked about the downhill playmaking, second side creation. You specifically mentioned the at-rim finishing. The mid-range game for him is almost non-existent near bottom of the league in attempts and efficiency. So similar to that conversation we had about Brandon Miller, I think there's opportunity for Toumani Camara to take advantage of, even if it's more in through the lens of like a post-up game, right? Like posting up smaller defenders, making sure that he takes full advantage of his physicality and leverages that, whether it's scoring out of a post up or, throwing in post ups, including passes, making sure that he can be more of that connector, not necessarily purely a play finisher. I think he's taken enough meaningful steps forward in terms of his understanding of the game, where he needs to be on the floor, where he operates the best. I think he's improved enough in those areas for the Trailblazers to give him a little bit longer of an offensive leash than he's had. But man, just how awesome of a player he's been to watch. And he's truly been one of the best developmental stories that we've seen in the NBA over the last few years. Any chance I can get to talk about someone like Toumani Camara, I'm going to take it. But that's going to do it for today's episode. Thank you for making Locked On your first listen every single day. For your second listen, go find Locked On NBA Fantasy Basketball. Josh Lloyd hosts the #1 fantasy basketball podcast, giving you daily tips and helping you win your league, all while making you a smarter NBA fan. Find Locked On Fantasy Basketball on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, thank you all for listening to the show. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week.